The winter was dying slow that year, though the land refused to believe it. Frost still clung to the split-rail fence, thin as glass, and the sky hung low, heavy with unfallen snow. The air was so still it carried the faint creak of old boards from the barn and the wheeze of a lone windmill turning against the pale horizon. Elias Harlow worked the corral in silence, his breath a ghost before him. The cattle were few now, lean, quiet things that followed him without protest. He moved among them like a man tending ghosts. His hands were cracked, his beard rough with gray. His eyes, though, were sharp, a color that had once matched the open sky, but now looked closer to smoke. 5 years had passed since the flood took his wife and their newborn. The river had come down from the high country like a beast, loosed from heaven's cage, roaring through the valley, tearing fences and souls apart. He had buried what the current gave back: a wooden cradle, half a quilt, a shoe small enough to fit in his palm. Since then, Elias had spoken mostly to the wind and the cattle. The rest of the world had forgotten him, and he'd learned to return the favor. That morning, the coffee on his stove was bitter and black. The day smelled of thawing mud and cedar smoke. He thought it would pass like any other: chores, silence, another night of wind against the windows. But as he lifted the latch to the barn gate, something shifted in the far distance, a sound that did not belong to the wind or the prairie. Wheels. Slow, deliberate, the kind of wooden creak that carried meaning. Elias turned toward the ridge, squinting through the veil of mist that clung to the low country. There, faint and uncertain, a wagon crawled up the rise. No one came this way anymore. Not since the flood, not since the trails washed out and the mines shut down. He waited, hand resting on the gatepost, until the shape drew nearer. The horse was thin, the wagon covered with torn canvas. When it stopped before his fence, 2 figures stepped down, small ones. They were girls, twins, perhaps 5 years old, maybe 6. Their faces were streaked with road dust, their shawls threadbare and damp from travel. One held a bundle, the other a small tin pail. Together they stood at the gate, motionless except for the way the wind tugged at their braids. Elias froze. No one had called him Pa in years. No one had called him anything for months. He stepped closer, boots sinking in soft thaw. "You girls lost?" he asked, voice rough from disuse. Neither answered. The smaller one nudged the other, who took a trembling step forward. She lifted something from her pocket, a small silver locket, dull from age and grime. When the wind shifted, Elias saw it clearly. The initials engraved on the front were his wife's. The girl's lips trembled. "Daddy?" she whispered. Elias's chest went hollow. He stared at them as if looking at ghosts, her eyes, her mouth, her very tilt of head. It couldn't be. The flood had taken them both. He'd buried that truth with his own hands. Where did you get that?" His voice cracked like dry timber. The taller girl blinked, frightened but brave. "Mama said to find you," she said. "Said you'd know what to do." Elias felt the world tilt. The wind moaned through the cottonwoods. Somewhere far off a crow called once and was gone. He could have turned them away. Should have, maybe. The plains were full of strange tales, lost children, cons, and grief-made illusions. But when he reached for the locket and felt its cold metal in his palm, the last of his breath left him. It was real. Every scratch, every dent, every memory, real. He looked at the 2 faces before him, dirt-smudged, uncertain, but bearing the unmistakable mark of the woman he'd loved. "Come inside," he said finally, voice low. "You'll freeze out here." They followed him up the porch steps, boots small against the old wood. The hinges groaned as he opened the door, the sound of a house waking from long sleep. Inside, the fire had burned low. Elias stoked it with trembling hands, watching the girls huddle near the warmth. They were silent except for soft sniffles. He poured them each a cup of weak coffee, then replaced it with warm milk when they grimaced. The house had never looked so full, or so strange. 2 shawls draped by the hearth, 2 sets of eyes watching him like he held all the answers in the world. But Elias had none, only questions that burned like dry tinder. When the girls had eaten, bread, beans, a bit of jerky, they fell asleep curled together on the settee, the locket resting between them. The fire threw their shadows on the wall, small and still, like twin echoes of someone gone. Elias sat across from them, staring into the flames. His hands were shaking. He told himself he'd take them to town come morning, ask around, find whoever had sent them. It had to be a mistake. Had to be. But deep down, in the place grief couldn't quite kill, something began to stir. A warmth he didn't trust. Outside, the wind softened. The snow clouds broke apart, letting thin sunlight spill over the valley. It caught on the river far below, the same river that had stolen everything from him, and for the first time in years, it didn't look like ruin. It looked like a road. Elias leaned back in his chair, unable to tear his eyes from the sleeping girls. Their small hands, identical, rested together. Their breathing was steady, innocent, unknowing. He whispered into the quiet, more to himself than to God. Could it be? The house didn't answer, only the steady pop of firewood and the sigh of wind through the rafters. But somewhere, faint as a prayer, the world shifted. And in that fragile stillness, the frozen heart of a widower began to beat again. The next days passed in a silence that wasn't quite peace. Elias moved through his chores as he always had. But now there were two sets of eyes following him from the porch. Two voices whispering questions he wasn't ready to answer. The girls called themselves Ada and June, names as soft as their laughter, as stubborn as their curiosity. They followed him like small ghosts, barefoot in the morning frost, chasing chickens and gathering kindling. When they smiled, the years he'd lost seemed to fold and blur. At night, they slept in the loft above the kitchen. Elias would sit by the fire and listen to the old boards creak beneath their shifting weight, the faint hum of lullabies traded between them. It had been 5 years since a woman's voice had filled that space. 5 years since the scent of rose soap and hearth smoke had mixed in the air. Now those things returned without permission, seeping through the cracks like forgotten sunlight. He tried not to look at the locket when it caught the firelight, tried not to remember the hand that once wore it, but memory is a thing that knows no mercy. The girls asked often about their mother. Elias answered as little as he could. She's gone, he'd say, each time shorter than before. Ada would frown. June would press closer to her sister. She said you'd say that, June whispered once, and that single sentence hollowed him. The weather turned colder, as if winter had changed its mind about leaving. A bitter wind swept down the valley, rattling windows and howling through the barn rafters. The twins fell quiet then, wrapped in quilts and shawls too thin for the season. When Ada began to cough at night, Elias boiled water, brewed herbs, and prayed she'd sleep it off. But by morning, her fever burned through the cloth on her forehead. He hadn't been to town since the fall. Didn't care for the stares or the gossip. But necessity has a way of pushing a man past his comfort. He saddled his horse, leaving June in Mara's old wool coat, and a promise that he'd be back before sundown. The town lay 10 miles east, where the prairie bled into muddy tracks and smoke rose from the blacksmith's forge. The trading post hadn't changed. The same creak of the front step, the same smell of tobacco and wet hides. When Elias stepped inside, conversations fell quiet. Men at the counter stared. A woman near the back nudged her friend and whispered behind her palm. He ignored them, asking for quinine and camphor. The storekeeper nodded slow, then finally said it, the question hanging in every gaze. Heard you've got children now, Elias. Elias's jaw set. Just visitors, he muttered. The man shrugged, voice casual but sharp. Funny kind of visitors calling you daddy. Folks say your wife drowned in the flood. Guess they were wrong. Elias didn't answer. He left the coins on the counter, took the medicine, and stepped into the gray daylight, his stomach twisting with anger and disbelief. Across the street, a woman stood beside a chestnut mare, watching him. She wore a buffalo hide coat trimmed in beadwork, her hair braided and tied with leather. There was a stillness about her, like the land before rain. He knew that face, though it had aged. Mara. Years ago, she had joined the search party after the flood. Her people lived upriver, near the place where the water finally gave back its dead. She had been the last to tell him to stop looking. Now she gave a small nod, almost gentle. "You're hard to find, Elias Harlow," she said. He swallowed the bitterness on his tongue. "Didn't think anyone was still looking." Her gaze softened. "Some of us never stopped." They stood in silence until the wind lifted her braid over her shoulder. Then she said, "Ride home before dark. I'll come by when the light's right." "There's something you need to hear," he wanted to protest, but the tone in her voice left no room for it. She spoke not as a stranger, but as a messenger. By the time Elias reached the ranch again, the sun was sliding low. Ada's fever had eased, her small hand cool against June's arm. He sat beside them, the medicine bottles lined neatly on the table, his mind far from peace. As dusk bled into evening, a soft rhythm rose outside, the sound of hooves on frozen dirt. Elias stepped out, rifle in hand, more from habit than threat. Mara dismounted by the gate, a folded paper clutched in her glove. "Didn't come to stir trouble," she said quietly. "Only to bring what was promised." Elias said nothing, only waited. She handed him the letter. The edges were worn, the ink blurred from moisture. On the back, faint but unmistakable, was his wife's handwriting. To Elias Harlow. His breath caught. He turned it over, afraid to open it, as if the act itself would unmake him. "I was there when she wrote it," Mara said. "It was the winter after the flood. She'd been taken in by our band, found near death on the river's edge. She thought you'd gone under, same as the child she carried." Elias looked up sharply. "Carried?" Mara nodded. "She birthed 2 girls that spring. Yours, Elias, both of them." The ground seemed to tilt beneath him. He took a step back, gripping the fence rail as if to steady the earth itself. The world went soundless except for the blood in his ears. "She stayed with us until the fever came again," Mara continued, her voice steady but soft. "Before she died, she made me promise I'd bring them home to you when the time was right." Elias opened the letter then, though the words blurred before he could read them all. "If you are reading this, my love, it means I could not come back myself. Tell the girls their mother loved them with all the life she had left." He closed his eyes. The letter fell from his hands, landing in the dust at his boots. The dusk light turned red across the valley, staining the fields like memory itself. The armor he'd built around his grief cracked open. All those years he'd cursed the river, cursed himself for not dying with her. And all along, life had found a way to return, small and breathing, calling him Daddy. Mara stood quiet beside him, hat lowered. "They're good children," she said, "strong. Like their mother." Elias swallowed, unable to speak. When he finally did, his voice was hoarse. "I stopped searching too soon." "No," Mara said, looking toward the cabin's window where 2 small silhouettes swayed in firelight. "You just forgot what hope looks like." The sun dipped behind the ridge, and the sky went the color of mourning cloth. Inside, the twins slept soundly. Outside, Elias Harlow stood in the gathering dark, letter in hand, and felt the weight of 5 long years collapse beneath the single truth that love, somehow, had survived him. The storm came rolling in slow, the way trouble often does. By sundown, the horizon had turned the color of bruised steel, and a low thunder murmured over the ridge. The air itself felt swollen, charged, restless. Every living thing on the land seemed to hold its breath. Elias Harlow stood on the porch, arms crossed against the chill, watching the first sheet of rain sweep across the valley floor. The smell of it, wet sage, iron, and coming change, filled his lungs until it hurt to breathe. Inside, the twins stacked blocks on the rug before the fire, their laughter muted beneath the growl of thunder. Mara moved quietly through the kitchen, her steps soft as smoke. She had stayed after bringing the letter, saying the weather would make travel unsafe. Elias had not argued, though his mind wrestled with the weight of her presence. Each glance toward her stirred the ghosts he'd fought so long to bury. She wore a shawl woven in deep reds and earthen browns, the same pattern Claire had favored. When she leaned near the firelight, shadows licked the edge of her face, and for one cruel heartbeat, he saw his wife's reflection there. He hated himself for it, for wanting to see her again. Even as someone else, Mara seemed to sense his unease. She kept her distance, speaking little, When she did, her words carried the calm rhythm of someone who'd spent a lifetime listening more than talking. After the girls went to bed, Elias poured 2 mugs of coffee and sat opposite her at the small kitchen table. The lamp between them flickered as wind pressed against the walls. "You knew her," he said finally. "Knew Claire." Mara's gaze didn't waver. "I did." He leaned back, jaw set. "Then tell me what kind of woman she became. Because I don't know anymore. I buried one version of her and met another through your story, which was real." The corner of Mara's mouth lifted, not a smile exactly, but something sadder. "Both," she said. "She was broken when we found her, fevered, half-starved. For weeks she didn't speak your name, but when she did, it was with a kind of ache I can't describe. Said you were the only man who ever saw her as more than a preacher's daughter?" Elias looked down at his hands, scarred and rough, turning the mug between them. He remembered her laugh, the way it used to fill this house like sunlight. "She taught our children to read," Mara continued. "Told stories about the sky, the prairie, the river that took her. Said one day she'd bring her daughters home. Lightning flashed outside, and for a moment, the entire room was cast in silver light. The next instant, thunder crashed so close it shook the windows. Elias rose, restless. "You tell a fine tale," he said. "But all I have are your words. No proof, no grave. Just 2 girls who call me daddy and a story too big to believe." Mara didn't flinch. "Belief doesn't make it true, Elias. Love does. She never stopped loving you. Not even when she thought you were gone." Another thunderclap cracked overhead, closer now, and the sound of wind against the roof made both of them look toward the barn. "The roof," Elias muttered. "If it gives, the horses will panic." He pulled on his coat and stepped into the night. Rain struck his face like cold stones. The lantern light from the porch reached only so far before vanishing into the dark. He could hear the horses inside, restless, hooves striking against the boards. Inside the barn, the air smelled of sweat and hay and wet leather. Wind pushed through the gaps in the walls, driving rain onto the stalls. Elias climbed the ladder to the loft, fighting the surge of water pooling through a split in the roof. He tossed a tarp across the gap, hammering it down with the side of his fist, cursing every gust that tried to tear it free. Lightning ripped open the sky again, followed by a crack of thunder so fierce it seemed to shake the world apart. Below, one of the mares screamed and kicked. Elias slipped in the wet straw, landing hard on his shoulder. For a breathless moment, he saw nothing but flashes, the storm, the past, the face of the woman he'd lost, all tangled into one unrelenting vision. Then he heard it, the faint cry of his daughters at the barn door. "Daddy!" Their voices pierced the storm, small and desperate, echoing through the rafters. Just like his own voice once had when he'd shouted for Claire on that flooded night when the river answered him with silence. He got to his feet and shouted back, "Stay inside! I'll be there soon!" By the time he reached the doorway, the rain had soaked him through, his hair plastered against his forehead. Mara stood just beyond the steps, a blanket draped over her shoulders. She reached for him without hesitation, wrapping the wool around his shivering frame. The pattern of it, red diamonds and black thread, was the same as the one Claire had used during that final winter. He looked at Mara, and in her eyes saw the same sorrow he carried. "She's gone, isn't she?" he said, voice breaking like dry wood. Mara nodded once. "Last winter. She grew weak again. Fever took her before the snow melted. Her last words were your name, and the girls." Elias closed his eyes. The rain ran down his face, though some of it wasn't rain. He wanted to curse the heavens, to demand why mercy always came too late. But no sound came, only the steady drum of water on the roof, and the fragile warmth of a woman who had carried his wife's final promise across miles of grief. The twins clung to his legs then, crying into his coat. He knelt, pulling them close, his arms shaking with a strength he hadn't known in years. "It's all right," he whispered. "It's all right now." Behind him, lightning flared one last time, and the storm broke open, sheets of rain falling like absolution. The land, parched and wounded, drank deep. Mara stood at the doorway, her shawl clinging to her shoulders, face lit by the firelight spilling from the cabin. For a long while, None of them spoke. When the thunder finally faded into the distance, Elias rose, lifting Ada and June into his arms. He looked once toward the sky, that endless, unanswering sky, and found for the first time in 5 years that it didn't look cruel, it looked clean. He turned toward the house, Mara beside him, and together they walked through the rain, a man washed of disbelief, a woman carrying the memory of another, and 2 small girls whose laughter someday might sound like forgiveness. The days that followed the storm came quiet, as if the land itself were catching its breath. Puddles shimmered across the pasture, and the air smelled of damp earth and new beginnings. The twins chased each other through the yard, their laughter startling the crows from the fence posts. Inside the cabin, the fire never went out. Mara stayed. She didn't ask permission, and Elias didn't offer it. She simply moved through the days as though she belonged there, chopping kindling, mending the torn quilt, teaching the girls a soft Lakota lullaby that drifted through the evenings like smoke. The house, long, hollow, and silent, filled with life again. Elias watched from a careful distance. Gratitude warred with unease. He'd spent 5 years making peace with emptiness, and now the sound of footsteps in the hallway unsettled him, more than silence ever had. At breakfast, Mara would hum while stirring the pot, and Ada would try to match the tune. June would ask question after question, about their mother, about the people Mara came from, about why the stars looked brighter here than in town. Sometimes, Elias answered. More often, he didn't know how. In the evenings, he found himself lingering on the porch after chores, listening to their voices through the half-open window, laughter, stories, a half-sung prayer. And each time, a part of him softened, though he told himself not to. Hope, he'd learned, could wound worse than grief. By the 4th day, word had spread through the valley. A pair of riders from town showed up uninvited, cutting through the mud with that easy arrogance of men who believe their opinions carry weight. Evening. "Harlow," one of them called as they reined up near the fence. "Heard you've got company out here." Elias wiped his hands on his coat and stepped closer. "Company's no concern of yours." The taller of the two spat into the dirt. "Just curious. Folks been talking, saying you brought home some squaw woman and a couple kids that ain't rightfully yours." Something old and cold stirred in Elias's gut. He'd known these men once, worked beside them, shared drinks, shared loss. But now their faces looked small. "She's a friend of my wife," Elias said evenly. "And those girls are my blood." The shorter man gave a laugh that wasn't kind. "That right? Hard to tell what's what these days. You sure she ain't got her own reasons for sticking around? Heard some of them don't mind playing wife if the house is big enough." Before the words had fully left his mouth, Elias stepped forward, closing the space between them. His voice came out low, steady, dangerous. "You come out here to gossip or to start something?" "'Cause I'm too old for talk that don't mean a thing." The men shifted in their saddles, exchanging uneasy looks. The taller one tugged his reins. "Didn't mean no offense, Harlow, just folks like to know what's happening on their borders." "Then tell 'em this," Elias said, eyes sharp as a drawn blade. "This ranch, this family, they're mine. Anyone who's got a problem can come tell me to my face." The shorter man scoffed, muttering something about Indian meddling, but the thunder in Elias's stare silenced him quick. They turned their horses and rode off, mud flying from their hooves. Elias stood there long after they were gone, chest tight, heart hammering. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't reached for his gun, but for the first time in years, he'd stood for something that wasn't just ghosts. That evening, the mood inside was different. The girls sensed it, speaking in hushed tones as they played. Mara moved quietly, her usual calm tinged with unease. When Elias entered, she met his gaze across the firelight. "They came," she said softly. "The ones who talk," he nodded. "They won't be back." "You can't fight every whisper," she said, setting a pot over the flames. "Some things are too deep-rooted. I don't aim to fight them," Elias said. "I just won't let them talk for me anymore." Mara studied him a long moment, then smiled faintly. "Your wife said once that you had a stubborn streak as wide as the prairie," He almost smiled back. She wasn't wrong. For a time they sat in silence, the fire snapping between them. The girls drifted to sleep near the hearth, their small bodies curled beneath the quilt Mara had mended. When the flames had burned low, Mara rose, taking her shawl from the peg. "I should leave in the morning," she said. "The girls are safe here. My being here will only stir more talk." Elias watched her hands, steady and strong as she folded the cloth. "Where would you go?" "There's a trading camp west of the ridge. My brother's there for the winter. I can help him." He hesitated, then stood. "Mara." She looked up, and something unspoken passed between them. Not desire, but a recognition deeper than that. Two people who'd both carried the same woman's memory, the same loss, the same impossible promise. "You brought them to me," Elias said. "You did what she asked, but leaving now, they'll need more than just me. They'll need someone who knows both sides of where they come from." Mara lowered her gaze. "And you? What do you need, Elias Harlow?" He took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere long unused. "I need to stop living like the dead." The words surprised even him. They hung in the air, simple and final. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and the coals pulsed like slow heartbeats. Mara unfolded the shawl again and set it over the twins. "Then I'll stay a while longer," she said quietly. "Until spring, maybe," Elias nodded once. That was enough. He sat beside the fire as she returned to her seat, both of them watching the shadows dance along the walls. For the first time since the flood, he felt something like steadiness return. Not joy, not peace, but a kind of courage. In the soft crackle of the fire and the even breathing of the girls, Elias realized that redemption wasn't found in solitude or penance. It was in the act of protecting what still lived, of standing between what was lost and what could yet be saved. And in that small, weathered cabin, under a roof held together by more faith than nails, something fragile yet fierce began to take root again. By the time the snows retreated from the gullies, the land had softened to mud and promise. The creek ran high, swollen with meltwater, and the wind smelled faintly of grass instead of frost. Spring had come to the valley, hesitant at first, like something afraid to hope again. For the first time in years, Elias Harlow woke to the sound of laughter instead of wind. The twins were out early, chasing each other through the pasture, their braids bouncing as they ran. Mara hung laundry on the line, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, the morning light glinting on her hair. Elias stood by the porch rail, mug in hand, watching as steam curled up like ghosts dissolving into air. There was peace in the simple rhythm of things, chores done side by side, the smell of coffee and wood smoke blending in the air, the faint hum of a tune Mara often sang when she worked, the kind of peace that didn't demand to be noticed, only felt. Each day brought a quiet task, and with it, a small piece of healing. Together they mended fences, replaced shingles, cleared the creek of winter debris. The twins followed along, eager to help, laughing when Elias lifted them onto the wagon or handed them the hammer. When the work was done, they'd sit under the cottonwood by the corral, eating biscuits and listening to Mara's stories, old tales of spirits, rivers, and the language of birds. Elias would watch the girls' eyes widen, seeing Claire in every expression, every tilt of the head. And when they'd turn to him and ask for his stories, he'd tell them about their mother's laughter, how she used to hum while churning butter, how she once painted the barn door red because a home should always have a little fire in it. At night, after the girls had gone to bed, Mara and Elias often sat on the porch saying little. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It had turned gentle, like a hand resting without pressure. One golden evening, the sky burned orange and violet as the girls gathered wildflowers near the fence. They wove the blossoms into Mara's dark hair, tiny bursts of color against shadow. Elias watched from the porch, heart caught somewhere between ache and wonder. The sight was so simple, so human that he couldn't look away. When Mara noticed his gaze, she smiled, not shyly, not boldly, but with a quiet knowing. Later, after the girls had fallen asleep, she sat by the fire braiding her hair again. Elias fixed a loose shutter and spoke without turning. Never thought the house would feel this alive again. Mara's voice was soft. It was never the house that was dead, Elias. He paused, tools still in hand. No, I suppose not. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain from the west. The lantern flickered on the table. For a moment, everything felt suspended, the warmth, the light, the faint hum of new life trying to stay lit. It began with a sound, a sharp crack in the night, followed by a flicker beyond the window. Elias was up before the second sound came. He threw open the door to see the barn glowing with sudden light, flames licking up the sideboards. A lantern must have tipped, maybe left too close to the straw. "Mara!" he shouted. She was already behind him, throwing a shawl around her shoulders. The twins stirred, frightened, but she turned to them calmly. "Stay inside. Don't come out until we call." Together, Elias and Mara ran through the yard, the wind pushing smoke into their faces. The fire roared, devouring the lower beams. Inside, the horses screamed and kicked against their stalls. Elias pulled his coat over his mouth and plunged through the doorway. The heat was suffocating. He unlatched the first stall, slapping the horse's flank until it bolted into the night. Another followed and another. When he turned, the roof crackled above him, raining sparks. Mara appeared in the doorway with a bucket, throwing water on the flames near the feed bins. "You can't fight it from in there," she shouted, but Elias didn't stop until every stall was empty. When he stumbled out, coughing, his arms were black with soot. Together, they beat at the flames with wet burlap, pouring water again and again from the rain barrels. Hours seemed to pass in a blur of smoke and shouting and wind. By the time the last flames hissed into embers, dawn had begun to gray the sky. They sank to the ground beside each other, trembling, their hands blistered, their faces streaked with ash. The air reeked of smoke and wet earth, but the barn still stood, scorched, battered, but alive. For a long time, neither spoke. Only the sound of the wind and the distant cry of a horse broke the silence. Then Mara reached over and took his hand. It was a simple thing, no ceremony, no declaration. Just her fingers closing around his, firm and steady. Elias looked at her, and for the first time in years, the sight of another person didn't make him flinch. Her eyes were tired but bright, reflecting the small flame still burning in the wreckage. "You saved them," she said. He shook his head. "We saved them." The sun lifted over the ridge, gold light spilling across the yard, catching the smoke like thin threads of silver. Elias could feel his pulse in his burnt palms, in his throat, in the place behind his ribs that had once gone numb. The fire had taken what was old and careless, the broken boards, the dry straw, the years of neglect, and left behind something raw and clean. Later that morning, while the girls fed the horses, Mara and Elias sat on the porch steps, hands still bandaged. The smell of smoke lingered, but it didn't sting anymore. The twins ran up, laughing, showing off a tiny bird's nest they'd found under the trough. Mara smiled, tucking a flower behind each girl's ear. Elias watched, the warmth of the moment soaking into him like sunlight after rain. The land was scarred, but alive. So was he. He glanced at Mara, and she met his look with quiet certainty. Between them, no words were needed. The fire had burned through grief and left in its place something gentler, not a replacement for love lost, but proof that love could live again. In the smoke and ash of that night, Elias Harlow found his second beginning. Weeks passed before the riders came. Spring had deepened into early summer, the pastures bright with clover and the scent of rain on the wind. The twins ran barefoot through the grass, chasing a stray calf toward the fence line, while Mara worked at the garden, sleeves rolled, hair tied back with a strip of linen. From the porch, Elias watched them with a quiet heart that no longer feared its own stillness. The ranch had healed. So had he. He'd repaired the last of the barn boards, scrubbed away the soot, and built a new door from pine cut in the hills. The days were simple now. Coffee before dawn, chores in the sun, laughter at dusk. Yet even peace has a way of being tested. It was near sundown when the dust rose on the ridge. 4 riders, slow and deliberate, their silhouettes dark against the amber sky. The sound of hooves carried across the fields, steady and certain. Mara saw them first. She straightened, her face unreadable. "Lawman," she said quietly. Elias nodded, already knowing. The world beyond the valley always took its time catching up, but it never failed to. He told Mara to take the girls inside, but she stood her ground beside him as the riders approached. The men wore dust and badges. Their coats were sun-bleached, their expressions wary. The eldest, gray at the temples, sharp-eyed, dismounted first. Elias Harlow. Elias stepped forward, hat in hand. "That's right." The man's gaze flicked toward the house where the girls peered from the window, then to Mara standing quietly behind Elias. "We've been following word from the township," he said. "2 young children missing from Lakota territory, and a woman thought to be harboring them." His eyes narrowed. "You know anything about that?" Elias didn't flinch. "They're my daughters," he said simply. The deputy shifted in his saddle. "Can you prove that?" Elias reached into his coat and pulled out the small silver locket, tarnished now, but still bearing Claire's initials. He opened it and held it out. Inside, a faded photograph showed a young woman with soft eyes and a half-smile, a newborn swaddled against her chest. "She was found after the flood," Elias said. "Lived with the Lakota for a time. Those girls were born there. Their mother's gone now. But I'm still here." The gray-haired man studied the locket for a long while, thumb brushing the photograph as though he could feel the truth in it. "And the woman?" he asked finally, nodding toward Mara. "Mara stood by Claire when I couldn't," Elias said. "She brought my daughters home. She's kin to me by heart, if not by law." The deputy's jaw worked. "Town folks won't like it," he muttered. "Saying you took in a—" Elias's voice cut through, low but unshakable. "I've lived long enough not to care what small men think of big things." The air between them was still. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. Finally, the gray-haired lawman closed the locket and handed it back. "A man ought to tend his own," he said quietly. "That's law enough for me." He turned his hat in his hands, a small gesture of respect, but one that carried the weight of understanding. "We'll report it settled," without another word. The men mounted up and rode off the way they came, the dust of their passing glowing in the last light of day. Elias stood watching until the horizon swallowed them. Only then did he let out a breath that seemed to come from years ago. Mara's hand found his arm. "It's over," she said softly. He nodded. "It's just begun." That night, when the air cooled and the stars came out bright as hammered silver, Elias saddled the horses. Mara helped the twins pack a basket of wildflowers and a small loaf of bread. They rode out under the half-moon, the prairie glowing pale and endless before them. The path to the river was long and quiet. Fireflies drifted above the reeds like sparks from another world. When they reached the bend where the water widened and slowed, Elias dismounted and lifted the girls down. "This is where she rests," he said. His voice was calm, but his throat ached. "Your mother loved this river. She said it sounded like the earth breathing." Mara knelt beside the girls as they placed the wildflowers among the stones. Daisies, sage, and a few early blooms of prairie rose. The twins held hands, whispering a small prayer they'd learned from Mara's people, words of release and remembrance. Elias stepped closer to the water. He crouched, letting his calloused hand trail through the current. The river was cold, steady, alive. For a long time he said nothing. Then quietly, "I should have looked longer, Claire. I should have believed." The wind moved through the tall grass as if answering. When he turned, Mara was there. The girls pressed close to her sides. Their faces were solemn but unafraid. Elias felt something shift in him, a slow, deep loosening of the old guilt that had bound his heart like iron. He gathered the girls into his arms. "Your mother's gone," he said, "but she left the best parts of her behind." Ada smiled through tears. "She left us," June nodded. "And you," Elias closed his eyes. For the first time, he let the river take his grief, carrying it downstream to where the water disappeared beyond the bend. The ride home was quiet. The sky flamed orange and red behind them, the colors of endings and beginnings both. The twins sang softly, a half-remembered lullaby Mara had taught them. Elias rode beside her, not speaking, because there was nothing left that words could add. When they reached the ranch, the lamps glowed in the windows, small, steadfast beacons against the dark. The smell of stew drifted from the kitchen. The world, it seemed, had made peace with itself. Elias carried the girls inside and settled them beneath the quilt. They slept quickly, exhausted from the ride. Later, he sat on the porch with Mara. She hummed an old tune under her breath, something low and comforting. The prairie wind moved through the grass, whispering against the boards. Fireflies blinked across the yard, bright as tiny lanterns. Elias rocked slowly, the creak of the chair steady as a heartbeat. He looked out across the land, his land, and felt, for the first time, no ghosts waiting in the dark. Only the living, only what remained. Behind him, the house glowed warm with quiet life, the hum of belonging, the sound of home. And in that sound, Elias Harlow found his peace.